You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, hello again, everyone. This is Doug Thorpe, and you're listening to another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. We're going to take a little bit of a departure today from our kind of business tactics and strategy topics that we frequently use. We're going to talk about individual health. And my guest, it really caught my interest because he is a specialist in health in terms of body weight. I use the term weight control, and as we were prepping, he corrected me, and he's going to tell you why that's a correction that needs to be made. His name is Jason Stanley. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Doug. Glad to be here.
So if I may, let's start with that very theme. You know, I, out of habit and culture and everything, I asked you about weight control, and you corrected me. So you share with the audience what you told me.
You betcha. Well, weight control is what we always hear. We have to control our weight. We have to control our eating. We have to control something about it that's causing us overeating. So before I get into why that's not the thing, I want to make the first point, and that is obesity is not the obese person's fault. I kind of say that slowly because I really want to emphasize it's not their fault. Now, let's make sense out of that. And why isn't it control? Well, now I've been working on this for a long time, and I've written a couple of books, and they had bad information in them. I'll say that right up front. And so trying to understand what really is going on is taken a long time. And I started in 1979, my first medical anthropology field research. Got the sense that it came out of childhood, but didn't know what to do about it. It's only been in the last 15 years that we know enough about the brain to understand what's going on in there. And that's all a prelude to say what it is. Obesity is the result of a compulsion that is hardwired, absolutely hardwired in the limbic system of the brain, and it creates the compulsion to overeat. So when it's hardwired, we think of somebody who has PTSD since Vietnam War. So they've had it for 50 years. That's a hard wiring. And when they're triggered, they can't not do the behavior. Well, it's the same thing here. When a person has the hard wiring in that part of the brain, and they get any kind of stress, any kind, it can be the internal stress or external. That can be something and for the obese person, hang on for just a second. It's stressful to be fat. Now, that's not a good term, but let's call it what it really is. It's stressful to be fat. It's horribly stressful to be obese in our society. And so just walking around with this irrevocably public weight, that's stressful. Well, in the way the amygdala works, it's binary. It's on or off. It's safe or danger. And, we always get the saber-toothed tiger example. Well, it's the saber-toothed tiger, or it's the men from the other clan around the corner who are coming in to steal your women. It's, that whole safety thing. Well, when a person is stressed, it's the same thing in emotional danger. And so they go to the place of safety. Well, that hard wiring will take you to eating. And that compulsive behavior is eating. Now, and I'm using the term compulsive here, Doug. Let me kind of define that for your audience. We have automatic behaviors, cultural behaviors. But the city I live in, and I'm in the Philippines, by the way, it's a city with universities and hospitals and all of that. So it's a real city, but there's not a single stop sign or even a stoplight, a blinking light, or nothing. There's not one, but the traffic flows. So that's cultural. Now imagine living where there are no stop signs. Yeah, exactly. People make a left turn in front of you. It's interesting, but that's cultural. Then you have habits. Lots of good books, Atomic Habits, etc. After that becomes our addictions. And we know how difficult that can be. And then after that, even more, multiple orders of magnitude more difficult to handle is compulsion. Addiction counselors will say, well, at the end stage of an addiction is compulsive behavior. That's when the person can't not do whatever it is that they're doing. And to kind of give your audience a sense of that, we know that out of 100 people, just 100% of the people who lose the weight, 97 will have the weight back. They'll gain the weight back in 18 months. Yet you go on site after site after site of clinics that will help people through addiction, and they boast a 30%, not 3% success, but 30% success over 5 years, clean and sober from cocaine or alcohol or whatever it is. So we see that compulsions are 3%, addictions are 30% success. So I'm putting this in. Now, when you say, well, okay, wait a minute, hang on, the person has an addictive, they have a compulsive behavior, and that compulsion is to eat. Even if they've suffered hugely and lost 100 pounds, they're still going to gain it back. And so that gives us understanding that it's compulsive, and the compulsions are hardwired in the brain. Heck, bariatric surgery, they have a great success rate. Only 50%, 51% of the people who've had bariatric surgery gain all the weight back. Only half. That's after they've turned their stomach from the size of a fist into the size of a thumb, but they still manage to somehow get enough calories in. So that's when I say it's not their fault, that's the point. It really isn't. And you have to, first of all, it's taken me, the dickens of a time to figure this out, only because of all of the brain research that's been done. And sometimes what I do looks like woo-woo. It's kind of like, magic, but it's not. It's all hardcore science. Now, I went on a long time, so we
have talked on this show. I've had other guests that have led us into some of the brain science that's out there to help thinking and mindset about leadership effectiveness and things such as that. So I'm certainly a big fan of the science, and I feel blessed that we now know this, and that you can get your aha answers to why things are the way they are. But I'll confess, this is for me a brand new thought about the weight issue. So I think the burning hot question, all right, it's a hardwired compulsion. How do you break that wiring?
That's a perfect question. Thanks. I'll send you your check for that question. Okay, this is going to sound a little woo-woo, and I apologize, but it's hard science. What you have to do is you have to activate the thought. Now, we do this, and I'm going to kind of shift a little bit here and talk about how people deal with trauma, because it's an easier thing to see. So if a person has PTSD, war veteran, or had a horrible accident or some crisis happen to them, and what you do is you have that person recall the memory of the trauma. So that pathway in the brain is now activated. It's up there. Now, in that, because it's trauma, their heart rate will go, their mouth will get dry, their palms will get sweaty, all the things. And then once that's half of the thing. You have to have that brain pathway, it's called a potentiated neural pathway. It has to be activated. Then you introduce delta wave. Now, delta wave, just a real quick thing. Right now, you and I are probably in beta. You have gamma, which is that real high frequency when you're in a panic, the swimmer or the non-swimmer who falls over the boat off the end of the lake. Then you go to beta, where you and I probably are, then alpha, which is kind of a meditative, really calm. Theta is when you go to sleep, and when you're real deep sleep, you drop down into delta. It's a very slow brainwave. Point is, it's a normal, natural thing. So you introduce delta wave while that pathway is activated. Now, how do you do that? Well, this is where the strange is. Okay, you rub your forehead and the upper planes of your cheeks. And just by stimulating the skin right here, also the skin on the outside of your arms and on the palms of your hands. Now, if you look, and I'm going to invite your listeners to look at the palm of their hand, the skin is very different than the back of we've all noticed that, but kind of don't pay attention to it. Well, the skin on these places I've mentioned are called gametic skin, and there's nerve receptors in that skin that, for whatever reason, I don't know why, but the egghead professors, thank for them. They know this, that when you do this, that creates delta wave. Now, when I'm rubbing my face, as I'm doing right now, on my forehead and on the planes of my cheeks, I'm creating 90 times, not 90% more, but 90 times more delta wave than is typically there. And if you were to put an EEG on my head, you would have that, you'd be able to see that. So that delta wave, what happens is when the brain is drenched, essentially that wave is running through the whole brain, it creates a chemical reaction inside the receptor neuron. And that receptor neuron then pulls up salt, essentially, that then loosens up the let's call it the bridge. And because you have, your neurons, you have a chemical and that's electrically charged going down from one neuron to the next. It jumps across and then goes inside and continues. Well, there's a portal that happens. So that's every thought that we have. We're talking right now and you're nodding as I'm talking. So you're thinking, well, that's doing that thing is constantly going, new molecules are dropping into your receptors. Well, a little portal opens up, closes, opens up, closes, opens up and closes. And each time that does it, it's unique to that molecule. But when it becomes permanently potentiated, that little thing that opens up gets stuck. And it gets stuck by proteins, and it's basically welded in for life. But when you bring in the delta wave, you've activated the pathway. So it's shooting down, right? Stress, 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 and it's going down the wave. And then you bring in the delta. So the delta wave, for what, I don't know how it works, but the reaction is that it brings up the salts out of the inside of the neuron. It dissolves those proteins, and that portal goes away. Now, the brain doesn't functionally change or doesn't change. You don't lose that neuron. You don't lose all that. It just goes back to its naive or natural state. And that's how you do it. Now, it is, if it's a mild trauma, it works real quickly. If it's something that's developed in childhood, which is the case with me, with the obese person, it takes quite a bit more because it's not an event. It's a childhood
series of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let me try to connect some dots here that based on,
Please.
Again, other discussions I've had with prior guests in the brain science area. There's a common man language that has frequently been shared when I've got someone who's done this kind of study or this kind of work. The notion that neurons that fire together are wired together. And we use that on the positive side of leadership coaching to encourage people to consciously and very intentionally think about a behavior they want to execute. So they want to change a behavior to be a more effective leader. They have to the first early steps are consciously, basically forcing yourself to do that. The analogy I draw up there, anybody that's tried to improve their golf game or their tennis game, they might hire a coach. The coach comes and looks at their swing or their grip or their stance, and they start tweaking. And the first many times you use that adjustment, it feels wrong. It's hard to comprehend, but the repetition in practice is what wires all that together. And also in athletics, they talk about muscle memory. Well, memory's in your brain. It's not really elsewhere, but or at least as I understand it. So coming at it from that angle, I hear what you're saying, but what you're talking about is using these delta waves to intentionally break some of that wiring so that you can go another direction.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that neurons that fire together wire together, because that brings up a whole secondary issue. See, my work, what we do is when you say, how do we break this connection? Well, what I just explained. By the way, the process is called havening, like a safe haven. It turned out that's kind of the common language term because depotentiated, permanently potentiated neural pathways is kind of a mouthful.
kind of a mouthful, yeah.
So the common language is havening. But what happens is when we're successful with this, that overwhelming, unrelenting urge to eat disappears. just disappears. It goes away. That talking in the, food chatter, we call it, disappears. Cravings disappear mostly. But every once in a while, even though this person for decades always cleaned their plate, everything, or always snacked all night in front of the TV. Well, now when they're full, they get the sensations of full, they just stop eating, and the dog eats the rest of the steak. The people in my programs, their dogs are all fat now. But what'll happen is out of the blue, they'll get this connection, and it's ice cream, say, right? And that's not ice cream. But what's happened for 25, 30 years, when they had the urge to eat, they would then eat ice cream. It's not the ice cream. It was that urge to eat. I need to feel safe. That's what's going on it's the amygdala portion of the limbic system. And so, but now they have this connection to ice cream. Oh, ice cream. And they'll go do it. Well, we do the same thing there, is we will bring up the ice cream and how delicious it is. And so, because when somebody has a craving and they're going, oh, wide-eyed and ice cream or chocolate or chips or whatever the craving is, well, that pathway is already activated. Now, it may not be the primary pathway in the amygdala that came out of childhood, but it's the neuron that has wired together. So then we treat it exactly the way we would with the primary. So this is a little cleanup work that happens. And by the way, the early part, you have to work with somebody to get the insights, what have you. But at the ice cream level, that's done at home by yourself, and you learn the tools, and they do it. People can do that on their own.
Well, you touched on something. You and I are both of the generation that was raised with the discipline of eat everything on your plate, and you can't get up from the table until it's done. And on one hand, that's good if your parental unit prepared a well-balanced meal, but the question, at least the traditional theory that goes with this, is it's portion control. So, when you look at a lot of the current weight loss plans, a lot of it has to do with calorie counting and portion control, or they come up with some fancy metric unit that is not as hard as counting calories or calculating calories, but they have catchy little scales and things to count your points and whatnot. And it ultimately is this fantasy of portion control will get you there. But what I think I'm hearing you say is nope. Is that compulsion is going to rise up again if there is one?
Yeah, nope that's a technical term. Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, let me attack that from a kind of a unique angle. You look at the person who is naturally always thin. They're just naturally thin. And if you look around, what are those people eating? Well, they're eating junk food, or they're eating healthy food, or they're vegan, or they're carnivore, or, so it wasn't, you can't say a healthy diet, because some of them are just, junk food junkies. And then I've got people like that in my work, in my research work. On the other hand, that naturally thin person will horrifically overeat at Christmas or Thanksgiving dinner, World Cup Day if they're not an American. They overeat. It's like a contest. You eat as many pieces of pumpkin pie as you can. Then as you're drinking your toddy afterwards, which is, more calories, you all complain and say, I ate more pie than you did. But why? The portions are completely out the window. And the bad food is there in many cases. So why isn't that an issue for the naturally thin person? And when we grew up, most people were thin. You look at your old movies, you'll see that.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
The day after Christmas or the day after Thanksgiving, and if you imagine you're off at a lake with a large family or work group, and you all come out for lunch the next day, and you hear the forks and all that for a minute, and then you look up and you say, wait a minute, what's happening here? All the thin people ate half their sandwich and they pushed it away. All the heavy people cleaned their plate. Well, what's going on is the thin people, they're not portion controlling. You say, what was, if you're the person that made the sandwiches, isn't that any good? Oh, no, it's great. Best sandwich in the world. But I'm just full. I'm not hungry. This comes the day after. And they have automatic portion control, if you can use that term, is they stop eating when they're full. Same thing. Think of it as a heavy, a mismatched spousal. You got one spouse really heavy, obese, and the other spouse is normal weight, and they both sit down and have a large bowl of ice cream every night. Well, that's way outside of portion control. It's also not healthy, all the things around it. But then the next morning, the obese person eats all their breakfast. The thin person leaves some scraps. At lunchtime, the obese person eats the entire meal. At lunchtime, you look if it's a brown bag person, you look in the lunch bag and there's pieces of the sandwich left in there because they're just full. They ate so many extra calories last night, empty calories, but nevertheless extra calories. And that ice cream, they're just not hungry. So portion control is not it. Now, let me back off just a little bit here. We hear the argument, calories in, calories out. Well, that's a foolish argument, except, wait a minute, it's real at one level. And that is common sense. 100 calories or 500 calories, whatever it is, of chocolate cake and soda pop hits the body very, very differently than 100 calories of steak or for the vegans, the avocado. The satiation in the brain, there's receptors, there's a whole bunch of science behind that. So yeah, of course, diet is not the issue, but of course, it has feedback.
Yeah. Well, what I was thinking is that that whole notion of the portion control, what I'm hearing you say, it's kind of ultimately more of an outcome for the person that is wired and thinking correctly about their body need for sustenance. And it's the other way around. They de facto control their portions based on what they did prior 24 or 48 hours.
Exactly.
And it's just kind of a default response at that moment versus the person who is struggling with their compulsion to eat.
And interesting, I'm listening to you talking. I should have said that. The stress of portion control, basically what you're doing is you're putting the person on a diet. They're having to hold themselves back.
Yeah.
They're controlling this compulsion by sheer willpower.
Yeah.
And as soon as they go off, they fall off the diet or whatever it is, just like that rubber band. Wham! And that's why you hear, they gain the weight back and more.
Yeah.
So when you're stressing them, you're doing exactly the wrong thing. So you'd be better off to meditate and go ahead and eat what you want.
Well, let me ask you this, a thought that came to mind. I was first, as you were saying that, I was kind of tracking. I'm not ashamed to confess to my audience, I've got extra pounds I need to work on. But part of it for me, not making excuses, but I was one of the many members of the world population that the year of the COVID lockdown, I added my COVID-19. I mean, literally 19 pounds, in that period. And why? Well, we were locked down. We were in a world stress. I mean, there was a clear window there that we literally didn't know what this thing was and were we all going to die? And, there was, and obviously people process that at different levels. But it was a real thing. Everybody in some way, shape, or form had to face their mortality. And that is a once-in-a-lifetime event that you really have to think about that. And we all did it together. And hopefully, to your point, if you're listening, we just had cross fingers pop up here. Hopefully it never happens again. But talk about that a little bit. Obviously, that stress might have taken somebody who was otherwise very much in control and living healthy habits and kind of sent them over the edge to the dark side.
That's an excellent question. And I have a kind of a pet name I call this compulsion the food monster. Now, it's more than even 50 shades of gray. You have the compulsive behavior, the hardwiring, which is either this tiny little cute pipsqueak monster, or it's the Godzilla that's taking over your life. And basically, you can look at somebody's body size, not completely, but say, okay, this person who is morbidly obese, they have a monster of a monster. The person who got the COVID-19, yeah, that's a little bit of hardwiring in there, and that's okay because it's so small that most of the time they can control it. Back to your original term. Yeah, they can control it. They may gain that 10, 15 pounds as they go through midlife. But if they say, hey, you know what, I'm pushing, well, I've got all gray hair. I'm gonna back off and I'm gonna go to the gym. You can do that if you don't have this overwhelming compulsion. Yeah, you have a little bit of compulsion, but we all have stressors, and we all have stress, and we all have control. So when life is okay, generally, and I mean, I'm talking okay, it's normal. And you have the argument with your spouse, but you've been married a long time, and you're going to get over it, and things are going to work. There's work that at work that needs to be done, but that's kind of the joy of being there. There's always issues, but it's not overwhelming. Now, the COVID situation, and you nailed it. We didn't know if we were going to live or die. And we were all in this thing, and we didn't have all of our normal stress relief. A lot of us guys, a lot of career people, they enjoy going to the office. It's a way in which they get a certain amount of status. They have identity. There's a lot of things that are tied up in our work. Well, COVID stopped a lot of that. So the stress was outsized, very outsized. And what that does is it takes away all of your coping ability. If you're in a situation where it's really, really bad, well, that's why people say they are emotional eaters. Under stress, they eat more. They always gain more weight during stress. Well, for the average person, and the people like you and I from our generation, that we were taught to clean our plate. Now, we have to kind of look at that a little bit and say, okay, what does that mean? Well, one thing I found in my work, that's 100%. Now, we know correlation is not causation, but I have 100% correlation that during childhood, consistently, the child was told at some level, either by behavior or literally told, that they are acceptable and a good child while eating. It doesn't have to be dinner was all fun and games and all that, but if you ate your spinach or ate those lima beans, that was my thing, lima beans. If I ate the lima beans, my mother was happy. And I was approved of for eating those lima beans. That was an approval. So I knew I was a good little boy. Well, that approval's in my head. When I eat, I'm good. Now you can take it all the way up to where it's a wonderful family dinner. That's the highlight of the day every day. And that person is going to be obese. So when we look at that, now you can be a clean your plate kind of a person, comes out of the 50s and or 60s. That was still going on in the 60s. And that you're going to have that little bit of compulsive wiring, but it's pretty minor. And it's not such a thing that you can't control it. You literally can control it. Say, hey, I'm getting a little pudgy. My belt needs to be let out another notch. I'm going to knock it off. No more ice cream for me. I won't have that second hamburger today. Yeah. Whatever it is. So, yeah.
Well, speaking of hamburgers, I've got an example of that. Again, as a child, I was the only child of a hardworking single mom, and the pediatrician she used for me actually told her, she was concerned, and she asked the question, he likes cheeseburgers and fries. What should I think about that? And the doc said, that's a well-balanced meal. And, and he listed off the carbs, the protein, the veggies with the lettuce and tomato. And he stressed, be sure it's fully loaded that way. Okay. Yeah. So guess what? I had lunch money every day, and there was this was very old school. There was a drugstore with a soda fountain, the literal sit down, order a meal fountain kind of deal. So I'd go up there every day for lunch, cheeseburger and fries, and then and sometimes when she came home, if she had had a particularly hard day, we'd go to another burger place that night for another hamburger. And
Yeah.
but I was thin as a rail. 'Cause of course I was a kid and I ran it all off and. In the play we did, but to your point though, that's a wiring that I have, and until a couple of years ago, there was still a very significant moment, emotionally, psychological for me when we went out to a hamburger place.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a place of solitude and comfort and fulfillment and rest and the whole thing. But for other medical reasons, trying to be proactive, I've abandoned beef. I haven't eaten beef in 4 years.
Oh,
So,
okay. Yeah.
and I'm fine with it, by the way. I don't. I think about the hamburger frequently, but it's a choice I have unwired in my brain, and I'm okay.
Mm-hmm.
And, people say, well, we want to go get a hamburger, and I'm going, fine, they serve other things. I can do other things there. So anyway, I say all that to your point about that notion of comfort. If you ate all your vegetables, you were approved.
Yes, you're approved, exactly.
And lavished with praise and acceptance for doing that.
And you got the cookie or you got the
and
dessert.
then you got your dessert, yeah.
Yeah, and if you didn't finish your meal, no dessert for you.
Yeah.
And that really goes to the point. That's the heart of my work, is looking at the childhood. What were the behaviors during childhood where you were approved of? And back to your listening audience, leadership. It's this strikes not only the person, the leader, but also a way of looking at the people who work for them. Rather than, because if the leader is thin and athletic and angry at the person who just is slovenly and lazy, well, that's not the case. They're not slovenly and lazy. That's not what obesity is. And so it's kind of a two-way thing. How do you deal with it yourself and understand what I said earlier? It's not a mental thing. It's a wiring thing. So, it comes out of childhood.
Well, I think to that point, what comes to my mind is there is no denying there is a cultural bias about thin, fit versus fat and
Absolutely.
or obese.
Yes.
And it is talked about in leadership circles as far as those who get promotions, those who get advancement. And it's often a very subconscious selection element when a hiring panel or a promotion panel looks at a slate of candidates. Nobody at that table, because they've been drilled on the law, nobody at the table is going to admit, I didn't choose Joe because he's overweight, but they didn't choose Joe because he's overweight.
Exactly. Yeah. We look to beauty. When we're young and we're choosing mates, choosing a spouse, we look to beauty. And, even features, healthy, thin, robust. The guy's got to be tall and powerful. The woman has to be attractive in the man's eyes. And overweight is let me back up. The reason we look to beauty is that at a very, very deep level in the brain tells us that person is going to produce good children.
Yeah.
And they're healthy. And somebody who's overweight, especially obese, they don't look healthy. They're not healthy. We intuitively understand that's a health challenge. And so, yes, the people don't get promoted. That's just a fact of life. If you want to be wealthy and you're obese from childhood, you're going to start your own company. You're going to have to take 100% control. There are exceptions, of course. We can always point to that. But in general, you're right. You nail it.
Oh, I distinctly remember encountering that at a very early age. I was in a high school organization and elevating up year by year in school, and approaching my senior year, I was going to be head of this organization. And I was asked by the faculty advisor who I wanted to pick for subordinates, deputies and vice chairman and all that. And I had a friend who I really admired and thought of as the right kind of spirit and worker for what we were going to be doing. But he was overweight. And when I proposed him to be one of my cohort team, this faculty sponsor said, no, he doesn't represent this organization well. I said, he sure does. Look at this list of contributions and accomplishments the last 2 years. There's nobody that's done more for this organization. And the faculty guy said, we're not going to do it. We can't do it,
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, golly, that's unfair, And
yes.
But he was calling it out, and my friend, sadly, and we stayed in touch for many, many years. He struggled with that his whole life because that was the perception, that.
Yep.
And in his case, he did not have a good home life, and there were a lot of psycho-emotional things probably going on that I wasn't even aware of at the time, but learned later as we stayed friends and stayed in contact, and it's just a sad reality.
That brings up a real good point, that in my work, how that plays into it. Now, there's a big study done called the ACEs, ACES, ACEs study on obesity out of California, and they found that a little over like 51, 52% of obese people had high stress childhood. Well, the other part of that is that 49% did not. But what I found in my research, or I should say, and what I found in my research, is that those people who had the high stress childhood, they tend to be greater level of obesity. Because the thing is see, if you have let's say you're from a balanced, happy, kind of a wonderful gingerbread house, home and all that, but you have this thing about eating is you're a good kid. But you also know you get to go river rafting with a dad, and you get to play with mom, and she's a happy person, and she sings around the house, and all these other things. Maybe you've got animals that you get to spend time with, and hot rods, and as you go through all of that. Well, all these other things are wiring in your brain that they are stress relief. So as you become an adult, you've got a lot of places where you can feel good about yourself. Maybe you got really good grades, and that's another place where you feel really good about yourself. But the person from the dysfunctional family, they have very few places that they can feel good about themselves. So their food monster, that compulsion, is even more important. It may not actually be bigger than the guy down the street who had a good family, but it's the only relief he has. So, when he gets stressed, he can't go out and curry the horses.
Mm-hmm.
He just goes and eats.
Yeah.
There's
Wow.
another place.
Wow.
So your friend's situation kind of dictates that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jason, on that note, we need to wrap this up. I really thank you for sharing this. This has been very powerful. Tell folks the best way to get a hold of you if they're interested in learning more.
Well, they can get on my website, which is Never Gain the Weight Back. That's the point. Once you lose it, it's gone. Never gain the weight back. And what I would suggest they do is scroll down on the website and just click on, there's a free ebook, which is the first chapters out of the book that I'm writing. That book is not available yet, but it's free. Just click on it and read it. See if it makes sense to you. If it does, then just contact me through my website. But first, before you try to get in touch or anything else, read the book. It's free, and it's short and it's easy.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks again, Jason. This has been really important. And for any of you that are listening and have run through all the way to the end here, I do encourage you, if you're in a leadership role or wanting to be in a leadership role, you have to understand that one of the tenets of good leadership is, first, before you can lead others, you got to lead yourself. So if this is an area that you struggle, I am not advocating trying to pile guilt and grief on you, but I'm hoping that you have found this helpful and a good resource to consider to do what you feel you need to do to help yourself and be the leader you really want to be. So with that, I'm going to sign off, say goodbye. And by the way, I do want to remind you we have a video version of this over on YouTube, channel by the same name. We did a lot of hand signing here and demonstrations of techniques, so you might want to check out the video to understand for sure what those techniques are. But go over there on YouTube, same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Go out there, make it a great day. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.